Hi, good evening. My name is Charles Pope, and I'm the Interim Director of the Transborder Institute here at the University of San Diego. Thank you for joining us this evening for this special book presentation on Moving Beyond Borders, Julian Samora and the Establishment of Latino Studies. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a few words about the Transborder Institute, one of the co-sponsors of the event this evening. TBI was created in 1994 and became a unit within the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies in 2007. It has two main objectives. One, to promote border-related scholarship, activities, and community at the University of San Diego. And two, to promote an active role for the university in the cross-border community. To realize these objectives, the Institute engages in a variety of programmatic initiatives, research projects, and other activities such as this event. As I mentioned, TBI was founded in 1994, which means that 2009 marks the 15th year anniversary of the Institute. To recognize this achievement, we're going to be throwing ourselves a party next week on December 8th from 6 to 8 in the evening in the Rotunda, which is right outside the auditorium, and we hope that you can join us for that event if you have time. Moving along, I just wanted to thank the other co-sponsors of this event, the College of Arts and Sciences and the Ethnic Studies Department, whose significant contributions made this event possible. Tonight, we're here to present the publication, Moving Beyond Borders, Julian Samora and the Establishment of Latino Studies, which was edited by Alberto Lopez Pulido, Barbara Driscoll de Alvarado, and Carmen Samora. We are fortunate to be joined this evening by Alberto Pulido and Carmen Samora, who will be available to sign copies of the book that we're discussing this evening during the reception that follows this presentation. I do want to mention that we have books available for sale. The books that we received are hardback and not paperback, which means that they're a little bit more expensive. If you're interested in receiving another copy of the paperback, just find me or one of our staff and give us your business card or your contact information, and we can coordinate that through the bookstore. At any rate, the publication celebrates the life and legacy of Dr. Julian Samora, whose accomplishments are long and distinguished. I don't want to get too much into the details of his life and biography because I want to leave that to Alberto and to Carmen. But Dr. Samora was a Mexican-American scholar and activist from Colorado who dedicated his life to advancing social justice for and scholarship of Mexican-American and Chicano populations in the United States. His work led to the creation of Latino studies as a respected academic discipline and also contributed significantly to the creation of the National Council of La Raza, the largest national Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization in the United States. Without Dr. Samora's tireless efforts to establish Mexican-American, Latino, and border studies, many of us would not be here today, including myself, engaging in important and meaningful work to further the scholarship of these important topics. Now I'm just going to say a little bit about our speakers tonight. Carmen Samora is a doctoral candidate in American Studies at the University of New Mexico. She is the director of the Julian Samora Legacy Project, and I should also mention that the proceeds from the sale of the book go towards the Julian Samora Legacy Project and not as royalties to the editors. They wanted me to make sure that I said that. The Julian Samora Legacy Project is housed under the Southwest Hispanic Research Institute at the University of New Mexico. Carmen teaches courses in race and social justice, as well as biography, using oral histories and life stories of Latino intellectuals who were active during the second half of the 20th century. Her dissertation is entitled Los Tres, Galarza, Gallegos, Samora, and the Original Story of the Southwest Council of La Raza. Samora, through the Julian Samora Legacy Project, is continuing student mentoring and leadership development aspects of Julian Samora's legacy through web-based curriculum using the archives of many late 20th century Latino scholars. She has a master's in fine arts from the University of Notre Dame and a master's in education from the University of New Mexico. Moving Beyond Borders, Julian Samora and the Establishment of Latino Studies is her first book. Carmen Samora is the daughter of the late Julian Samora. Dr. Alberto Lopez Pulido is chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences and chair of the President's Advisory Board on Inclusion and Diversity at the University of San Diego. He teaches both introductory and advanced courses for the Ethnic Studies major, in addition to specialized courses in Latino and Chicano studies. His scholarly interests include the intersection of race, religion, and social justice, in addition to the history of ethnic studies in higher education and the intersection between race, music, and biography. Dr. Pulido has published a range of numerous essays in books and journals, such as the Journal of Catholic Social Thought, Cross Currents, Religion and Literature, the Journal of Religion and Education, Studies in 20th Century Quarterly, in 20th Century Literature Centro, the Journal of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, American Quarterly, and Latino Studies Journal. He is the author of the book Sacred World of the Penitentes. He is currently completing a research project on deportation, violence, and migration along the US-Mexico border with his colleague, Dr. Olivia Ruiz. Pulido was mentored by the first American sociologist in the nation, Dr. Julian Samora. So I'll ask Dr. Pulido and Carmen Samora to join us up on the stage and we can enjoy their presentation. Thank you.
Wow. So can you guys hear me? Great. Want to check?
Can you hear me?
Excellent. All right. Well, let me just begin by thanking everybody for coming out. We want to make this a very different type of book reading because we want to do as little reading of the book as possible. And more than anything, we want to tell you the story of this man's life. And we've got some incredible slides that we want to share with you. So please stick around for the slides. They're worth watching. And one of the things that Carmen and I decided to do is not to have sort of a formal presentation up at the podium, but to kind of sit here and talk with you folks. And we're going to kind of go back and forth on some things and kind of go from there. Before we do that, we want to recognize and thank folks who are here. I was very surprised by my mother who's here and my brother-in-law, my brother, and my family. So thank you for coming out. I appreciate that. And I also want to recognize the Ethnic Studies faculty who are here in Power and affiliated faculty. So welcome, thank you. Yeah. And students as well. Carmen?
And my husband is here, Steve Moffitt, with his cousins. So thank you very much for coming.
The first thing that we wanted to address, or that I wanted to address and begin with, is sort of talk about what this project means and what Julian Samora means. And this gets very emotional, so please bear with me, because this project was very emotional. It took a long time to develop, and so there's a lot here. But let me start off. Hopefully I can get through this, okay, folks? I represent one of 57 students that went through a program at the University of Notre Dame entitled the Mexican-American Graduate Studies Program. It existed for 14 years there. It was from 1971 to 1985. And I can sort of say that I was one of the last students, so I'm the younger of the group. I try to always make that a point. Because I went there, my senior colleagues were there in the early 70s when the program began. People like Jorge Bustamante and Gil Cárdenas, Miguel Carranza, people who are much older. And I got there in the early 80s. And so Julian had such an impact on so many of us and personally mentored, as I said, 57 students who either finished a PhD or went on to do a JD. And it was a very interesting program because basically he would acquire resources from external funding. And then he would go to departments and programs and ask if they would like, if they could find a student to fit this, then there would be resources available. And I'll talk about that later on. So I was very fortunate to be one of those students. So we have people who are trained in English, the majority of us are sociologists. We have people in political science and economics. And then we have a whole cohort of people who are attorneys. And since 2004, we proudly call ourselves Samoristas. Okay, it was a term that was coined at a Knox conference, and we have T-shirts. I was going to wear mine under my shirt, but I thought it'd be kind of Supermanish. But we have our, I don't think mine fits anymore, so that might be the problem. So we have our Samorista shirt, and thanks to Christine Sierra at the Knox conference, who sort of gave us that name. So what a big part of our conversation and a big part of the impact on higher education was this brainchild of the Mexican American Studies graduate program. It was initially funded through Ford dollars. The Ford Foundation brought that in. And I want to talk a little bit about the importance of philanthropy in higher education, especially for people of color, because that's basically how we got through higher education, especially during that time. And the role that Julian played in that, which was so important, which I don't think has ever been duplicated in the history of higher education. And so after Ford monies dried up, then he went to something called the Graduate Students Opportunity Program, which was a Midwest program that provided funding for schools in the Midwest. And I was under the GPOP program. I wasn't under the Ford program because the Ford program had already. So part of our kind of larger conversation to talk about is the importance of philanthropic money to educate students of color, and what does that mean? And there's trade-offs in that. It's not as nice as it sounds. There's complications with regards to that. And so therefore then, the project, the book, is about this work and what he accomplished. Let me also mention that aside from the 57 students that went through the program, there's countless number of undergraduates that have impacted, that Julian impacted on. I'm thinking in particular of Frank Castillo, who's now a medical doctor, and he was an undergraduate at Notre Dame, and he writes an incredible chapter in the book. And I'm thinking of Philip Gallegos, who's now an architect, and he teaches at the University of Mexico. These were undergraduates at Notre Dame who met Julian and whose lives were transformed as a result of that connection. And these are folks who did not go through graduate school at Notre Dame, but nonetheless, they had an impact. And I can name countless of other people who fit into that category. A little bit about this this personal story. You know, when I was sitting here thinking about this, I grew up here in Imperial Beach. I grew up here in San Isidro, and I hadn't been north of Santa Barbara and east of El Cajon. You know, I mean, I went to community college, I went to UCSD, and then I ended up in South Bend, Indiana in 1981, and it just, you know, radically changed my life in terms of leaving the Southwest, in terms of someone who was very much a nationalist in terms of the Chicano movement and Chicano studies, and not having an intellectual understanding of that. And one of the things that did for me was to take me out of that familiar environment and to put me in South Bend. Have you guys ever been to South Bend? I don't care how great the football team is, there's nothing to do in South Bend. Okay? It's like lame. And it's 90 miles of Chicago, 90 miles away from Chicago, and what you would always pray for is that you would have $6 to go on a commuter train that would take you into the city to spend time in Chicago, because there was very little to do. So you either studied or you drank, and most of us like to study. And so, so understand what that means. You have all these Chicano students from Texas, from New Mexico, from California, going to South Bend. And that really radically changed our point of view. It radically changed my life. It radically changed what it might mean, the meaning of snow. Because for me, the meaning of snow in San Diego was to go up to the Laguna Mountains and play in the snow for a few hours and come home. And there you lived in it. Okay, that didn't go away. It was like there, and it was, you know, wet snow. It was snow that you really had to understand. So my point is just to give you a sense of how your life radically changed, and you were forced to address issues with students who maybe you didn't know very well. I wanted to briefly read a page from our introduction that tries to capture this. So let me share the following with you. Most of Samora's students reproduced the path their mentor had traversed some 10 years earlier to find new and unique intellectual insights and perspectives. In a real yet mystical way, becoming a Samorista required one to leave the comfort of familiar surroundings to learn the lessons Samora had to teach. One had to experience the cold weather and the isolation to reflect on and imagine the relevance and significance of one's work. Leaving the familiar forced this emerging cohort of young scholars to compare the personal with the intellectual and to contrast the students' formative personal experiences relating to family and community with all those new experiences in the Midwest. This created an intellectual milieu in which scholars inspected and interrogated themselves in relation to the unfamiliar surroundings, which proved to be a challenge to their core sense of being. New possibilities for understanding and interpreting Mexican Americans on a national scale was the result. The critical outcome was the development of an intellectual character by students who for the first time in their lives were in a community with fellow students from other regions of the United States. They now were all part of the Mexican American Graduate Studies program experience. For Julian knew that each student carried in his or her heart a mind, a story, his heart and mind, a story and history as a result of his or her unique lived experience. The outcome was an awakening for numerous students and a reevaluation and personal interrogation of their perspectives that compared the local Mexican American experience to the national one. The Mexican American Studies graduate program was a model of consensus where people agreed to gather at a new and unfamiliar space and to discover their intellectual identities as young Chicano intellectuals with a mission to look back and seek answers to the issues facing their communities. Furthermore, it was a macro approach to Chicano studies throughout the United States and the world. To talk a little bit then about the book, it's written in two parts. We were talking about this earlier, we probably began it around 2003, probably at Carmen's kitchen table, thinking about this. There had been efforts to do an earlier project on Samora's life. He retired in '85 and passed in 1996. Unfortunately, he didn't see this come to pass, but I remember very vividly the importance of the project for him, as he personally told me that. And now I can rest knowing that it's been completed, and feel very proud of that. The book is broken into two parts. The first part is his personal and intellectual biography, who he is as a person, who he is as an intellectual. And the second part of the book is made up of 23 chapters written by Samoristas. It's broken down in different sections on community and political activism, which was a big part of who he was. And we have students, former students writing that sections. The second part is about his pedagogy, which is also written by certain students. The third section is research and the integrative process of Julian Samora, another section written by students, and then finally, personal reflections on the life of Samora. So if you were to pick up the book, if you want to know more about who he is as a person, you read the first part. If you just like to read these interesting vignettes and powerful stories about testimonies about people's lives, that's what you have then before you. I want to now turn it over to Carmen, who's now going to present us this amazing slideshow, so you'll get to better sense and know who Julian was and the impact that he had, not only in higher education, but on all of our lives. So, take it away.
Thank you, Alberto. And thank you for inviting me here. I am Julian Samora's daughter. I am the middle child of 5, and I'm the only girl, so that gives me a unique perspective on this story. Julian Samora was involved in almost every political aspect that involved Mexican Americans in the second half of the 20th century, and you probably never heard of him. His legacy of scholarship, leadership, and activism is a story worth telling, but not for his sake. It's a story worth telling for our sakes and for our children. When we developed this book project, we weren't sure exactly how we wanted to go about it. Our book is not exactly a biography, although there is a biographical aspect to it. There's a chapter that I wrote. There are the the essays that are personal stories of people who were mentored by Julian. Basically, the book is a collaborative effort, and that really mirrors the way that Julian worked. He was very much a collaborator. There are many stories and many approaches that I could share with you tonight, but the two ideas I want to share with you that I chose for this evening are, first, how in the world did a kid from a very poor town, a village really, seek education? And also, how did he become involved in developing leaders? Let me see if this works. Oh no, wrong thing. Ah, there. When asked why he had chosen the path of education, the prominent scholar Julian Samora answered simply, "I wanted an indoor job." Given the magnitude of his legacy, this answer may seem a little too facile, yet it makes perfect sense when one considers his humble beginnings. He was born in this town, Pagosa Springs, March 1st, 1920. This town was very much like any other town in Colorado. There was a lot of segregation. The Anglos and the Mexicans went to the same Catholic church, but the Anglos went to communion first, and then the Mexicans went next. They could both attend the same movie theater, but the Anglos sat on the first level, and the Mexicans were segregated in the balcony. When my father was born, his mother, Carmen, raised him. His parents never married, so he was scorned by some in his town because he didn't have a father. His mother had a third-grade education, and she worked as a domestic, and she cleaned the bank. She's there pictured on the right. He was also raised by his grandmother, and she's right there, Celsa Samora. Celsa was a partera, or a midwife, and a curandera, a healer. And she's pictured here with her children. This is Mike, Carmen, Tonita, Adelina, and these are Tonita's children. Some years ago, Tonita gave me a scrapbook that had belonged to Carmen. Carmen had died in 1939. And it was a book that Carmen had created of Julian's accomplishments. She selected all of his athletic ribbons, his school report cards, his certificates for good behavior, his achievements for history and English. Everything that he had collected, she put in this scrapbook. The scrapbook is a material record of Carmen's belief in her son's present and future success. It not only tells the story of the care and love of a proud mother, but it holds the clues to help us understand how Julian was able to rise from such poverty. There's Celsa. There's the outhouse. Here's Celsa again, and Julian's pictured right there. So they had a very poor existence. When I was a child, this picture was presented to me by my mother, who said that this may be a picture of Carmen and Julian's father. I found out later that it's Charlie Harris, Julian's father's brother. So this is my great uncle. So we didn't really grow up knowing about our grandfather Harris. We knew nothing about him. We didn't even have a picture. So when Julian went to grade school, he was put in the Mexican room. Here's Julian as a young boy. The Mexican room was a place where students in Colorado, in each school district, each school had a room where the Mexicans were put in first grade. They would stay there for 2 years to learn English. They were never tested. They just stayed there. My father said the irony of that is that some of the kids didn't know Spanish. They were Spanish surname, but they grew up with English speaking. So they were stuck in the Mexican room along with the Mexican Americans who spoke no English. And I want to contrast that for you with this short paragraph from Ken Martinez's chapter. Ken is now a lawyer, and he's the majority leader in the state House of Representatives for the New Mexico State Legislature. And he got a law degree at Notre Dame. The law school also lumped all the Chicano students together and told us we had to take a remedial English course to help us with our writing. It was a non-credit course we attended with the black students. Notre Dame was concerned about our writing, and they just wanted us to succeed. But it was kind of funny that they just assumed that we all needed it. They didn't do any testing or placement. We were just assigned to the class. After I handed in the first assignment, I was told I didn't need to return. So from 1926 to 1986, not much had changed. Here's Julian in grade school, and right there. And that's the school that he attended. It went from first through high school in Pagosa Springs. And there he is in high school. Julian had various jobs to help out the family. In summer, he worked with his uncle cutting and hauling logs for the Forest Service. He didn't really like working outdoors. He wasn't particularly good with his hands. He couldn't fix the equipment if it broke down. When school was in session, he worked as the evening desk clerk at the hotel where his mother worked. That job suited him better. He could read all he wanted when it wasn't busy, and the hotel was heated by the water from the hot springs Pagosa was named for, so there was no boiler to keep an eye on and nothing mechanical to break down. Julian graduated from high school in 1938, and he applied for a Bonfils scholarship. The Bonfils family owned the Denver Post, and they provided scholarships for Colorado high school graduates to attend college in a Colorado college or university. The year that Julian applied, 585 students applied, and they awarded 29 scholarships, and Julian got one. What happened, though, was that he wanted to refuse it because his mother, Carmen, was dying of breast cancer. I recently met, for the first time, his only surviving first cousin, and she told me she's 9 years younger than Julian, and she was around when he won the scholarship, and he told his mother, "I'm not going to take it. I'm going to work and take care of you." Now, bear in mind, Carmen was doing without his wages. By the time he reached 8th grade, he would normally have dropped out of school and work for a living to support his mother and grandmother. But his mother and grandmother insisted that he stay in school. So he said, "Well, now that I've graduated from high school, I'll get to college somehow." And she said, "No, you must attend school." There had been some talk, apparently, that he wasn't worthy to take one of these fellowships because he was Mexican-American. And she said, "You go show them what you can do." And then he said, "Well, I don't have any money. The scholarship will give me money for books and tuition, but not for travel." And I learned this from his cousin, Cordelia. She witnessed that Carmen told him, you can start your own little business, and I'll teach you how to iron shirts. So I didn't know this backstory. What I had learned was he had several jobs to augment the scholarship, which paid only for tuition and books. He worked in the college library where he met Betty Archuleta, who would become my mother. And there he is. And there's Betty. She remembered seeing a dashing, well-dressed, and handsome young man who seemed to be everywhere on campus. Mom said she started studying more and spending more time at the library to be sure to catch sight of Julian. One of Julian's favorite stories about himself was how he earned travel money. He set up a business washing shirts. He was so well-dressed because after washing and ironing his classmates' shirts, Julian wore them, then washed and ironed them and returned them to the owners. He earned a nickel a shirt. And what I learned is that Carmen taught him that skill. So she was very much involved in getting that boy to college. Now, Julian encountered many instances of discrimination. Oh, Carmen died when he was 19 years old, between his freshman year and sophomore year. So if you can imagine yourself at 19 being an orphan and what that must have meant to launch yourself. So he used these encounters with discrimination to push forward. And here's an example. A further look at his annual shows us that by his senior year, he was president of most of the clubs he belonged to. Julian used college very effectively as a training ground to learn to work among the ranks of the collective and then take leadership positions. Enjoying his success and popularity in college, he ran for student body president his senior year and lost when his roommate cast the deciding vote against him. His roommate told him, "Well, Julian, I couldn't vote for a Mexican." He then ran for a more prestigious position and was elected president of student faculty government. In that capacity, he oversaw the running of the college, and it was the governing body that determined the yearly budget and made decisions about campus life. So Julian graduated from college in 1942 with a degree in history and political science. And then he got a master's degree in sociology in 1947 from the Agricultural and Mechanical College, which is now Colorado State. He and Betty married in 1942. And at this point, Julian was determined that his brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law all go to college, and they all did. And if you can understand that at this time period for this ethnic group, this is very unusual. Not only did they all graduate from college, but the men each got advanced degrees. They all have master's degrees. And they tell me now that they would never have entered into the middle class without Julian's pushing. So where did he get these ideas about leadership? Because he was already working them through when he was in college. He met a man named George I. Sanchez when he was a freshman in college, and George I. Sanchez had just then recently gotten a degree in, I believe it was English, from Berkeley. He's one of the very first Mexican Americans to receive a PhD in any subject matter. So when Julian was going to graduate school for his PhD, his dissertation topic was on leadership that talked about the dominant and subordinate relationships of leadership in Del Norte, Colorado. And I quote from his dissertation: "The dominant system, therefore, very effectively siphons off the only possible inter-ethnic leadership without fully accepting it, and the subordinate group feels that there is no leadership. They do render favors and provide counsel, but only on an individual basis." And it should be noted that Samora's dissertation bibliography contained only one citation authored by a Mexican-American, and that was George I. Sanchez. Of 42 items listed in the bibliography, only 10 treated Mexican-Americans specifically. Only one entry studies Mexican-American leadership. Sanchez wrote a 2-page article published in 1950 by the Southwest Council on the Education of Spanish-Speaking People about the default of leadership. So therefore, Julian's dissertation was the first academic research conducted on the question of leadership in the Spanish-speaking community and its relationship to the Anglo-dominated system. And there he is with my older brothers, and there I am. So Julian launches himself into this career of teaching. Here he is with Lyle Saunders, who suggested him for his first postdoctorate job in the medical school in Denver, Colorado. And then in 1959, he was hired at the University of Notre Dame. And in the 60s and 70s, he was on, this is just a fraction of the consultancies and boards that he was on. And I include a picture of Herman Gallegos. Herman Gallegos, Ernesto Galarza, and Julian founded the National Council of La Raza in 1968. And these are some of the homes that he lived in and that we lived in. Gives you a variety of my life with my famous father. And there he is boycotting the AMP. Now I'm going to turn it over to Alberto, who will talk to you about the Mexican-American Graduate Studies program.
Well, the first thing you want to notice is that good-looking guy right there, you see him?
Oh, that's right. There he is. And there he is.
Check out those glasses. Well, anyway. Yeah, what do you think, huh? Can you see that?
There he
What do you
is.
think? Okay, this is supposed to be a serious presentation. So for those of us who took the journey to be part of the Mexican-American Graduate Studies program, in exchange for fellowship, you would be required to be part of a course, a 3-hour seminar. And as you can see here, this was a cohort of students that were part of the seminar in 1983, and I was there at the time. In that whole group of people, we have some attorneys, we have a priest in there.
This is Ken Martinez.
Ken Martinez.
Who I quoted from.
And the whole idea of the colloquium was to talk about issues related to the Chicano community. It's very open, very unstructured, and issues were raised. And you were just what he was trying to do was just gather people to find a sense of community and a sense of home in South Bend and at Notre Dame. And I always hear from people when I tell them that I went to Notre Dame that because it's Roman Catholic, it makes it much more accessible and much more of a sense of home. And I disagree with that because the majority of the school was Anglo and Afro. And we were graduate students also, which means very, very different from being graduate students. We weren't really connected. So as basic as this is, it took a major, it went a long way for us to gather weekly and to face each other. Just an example in there, we have representatives from Texas, Chicago, New Mexico, Spain, Virginia. That woman in the middle is a Chicana from Virginia, Colorado, San Diego. And so it was just this remarkable way of bringing us together and wrestling and talking about issues and addressing them.
Yeah.
This is the year of Samora's retirement, and this was when the initial idea of a book came forward. And here we are honoring Dr. Samora in 1985. And to state it very frankly, we really embarrassed the University of Notre Dame because they had never acknowledged the work that Julian had done. So all of a sudden, all of these Chicanos come back to campus and really bring to the light his important work. And it was, how many days was it? Like
3 days.
3 days, presentations. And at the time, the president of Notre Dame was Father Ted Hesburgh. And Father Ted Hesburgh always rides the coattails of civil rights, and his work he's done with civil rights in the early 60s. But his relationship with Julian was very complicated. And I think that it was a really mistake to not acknowledge his work, and that the campus really had to reflect and think hard about why in their own midst they had not given recognition to what Julian had done. And this is just a small sample of the students. We have a reunion in 2004 in Albuquerque at the National Association for Chicano Studies Conference. As you see, people have gotten a little bit older, a little bit fatter, and you know, life goes on. Just another thing. And let me say that you know, when you do good works, it shows, because there wasn't one hesitancy from students when we talked about doing this project. Everybody was on board. Everybody really wanted to see it happen. So that was incredible.
Then, as my father prepared for retirement, he and my mother bought some property in Truchas, New Mexico. They tried to make adobes 1 week and then went down to Espanola and bought them, because it turned out to be a big, sloggy mess. And here's the house they were working on, and my mother was sick with ovarian cancer, and she died in 1979. And here's a few pictures of her. And so after she died, my father didn't want to live there, and we sold the place. But this is him at his retirement symposium, and he was very, very pleased with the student response. And Alberto?
Well, let me turn this thing back on. As Carmen had mentioned, Samora, along with Herman Gallegos and the late Ernesto Galarza, were critical in establishing the Southwest Council of La Raza. It was also funded through philanthropic projects through the Ford Foundation. Southwest Council of La Raza eventually becomes the National Council of La Raza. And the gentleman in the center is Raúl Izaguirre, who was the director of NCLR for the longest time. And I understand now he is the ambassador to the Dominican Republic.
Yes, yes, he's just been named last week.
And so here is a recognition of Julian and Herman's work. You know, Carmen is doing an incredible dissertation to bring out the work of Herman, of course, of her father, and also Ernesto Galarza, who is another person who we ignore. And the work that he did on the Bracero program and farm workers in this country is unprecedented. It's somebody that we don't talk a lot about, because Ernesto never held an academic appointment. He was blackballed by the Nixon administration. And it was through Julian that Ernesto's books got published, because Julian had a big influence on Notre Dame Press. It was a time when Notre Dame Press had a whole Chicano studies series, and he was the one behind it. And the reason we know about Ernesto's work today is because Samora really pushed Ernesto to get his work published. So Merchants of Labor, Spiders in the House, Workers in the Field.
And Barrio Boy.
Barrio Boy, which is an incredible novel on immigration, on border issues, the same things we're dealing with today with regards to guest workers. Read Galarza, he's ahead of his times in terms of writing in the 1960s, and yet we don't teach him, and we don't talk enough about him.
And Herman opened up philanthropy for Mexican Americans. He, through his contacts in San Francisco, he was able to make contacts with the Ford Foundation and the Rosenberg Foundation, so that when they were ready to give monies to Mexican Americans, he knew the people to contact. And it was the Ford Foundation that supported Julian in his first efforts, and Herman opened up those doors to philanthropy. Before that, they were literally closed to Mexicans and Mexican Americans. This is a calendar that the Budweiser company put together. And that's a photograph of Dad that my brother John took. He's a professional photographer. This was taken in my backyard, and that became the cover of the book. And while Dad looks jolly, he was giving my brother the hardest time because John was being professional, and this is the youngest kid, and John was trying to be serious about this, and Julian was just not taking it seriously, and so he's laughing at John, and John just snapped it in exasperation, and now we have it. And then in 1989, the Michigan State University named their research institute after Julian. And this again was somewhat embarrassing to the University of Notre Dame, where Dad had retired from 4 years previously. In 1999, after Julian was dead, they established the Institute for Latino Studies, and Gilbert Cardenas sits the Julian Samora Chair at Notre Dame. So they did kind of pick up. Alberto?
This is Dr. Samora when he received the highest recognition in Mexico, the Orden del Águila Azteca in Mexico City in 1990. It was Julian and Cesar Chavez. And this was actually probably one of the first years that it was done. I think it was probably the,
No,
was it? Was a couple before?
Yeah.
And Americo Paredes is not here, but he was also one of the recipients as well. And this is, of course, another image of him and the receiving of the Águila Azteca. I wanted to go into a few other things. We're getting close here to a conclusion, but just a few more things that I want to make sure that folks are aware of. We make a fairly bold statement in the book by basically saying that Julian is so critical for the establishment of Latino studies. And I want to just point out some things that help to support our claim and for people to think about that are really important from an academic standpoint. First of all, it's important to remember that he's the first Mexican-American sociologist in the nation. He gets his degree in 1954. Okay? So that's a very important point to raise, and in terms of that trajectory of time. You know, he's at Notre Dame from 59 to 85, so his contribution is tremendous. He's the first scholar to really put Mexican Americans on the map in terms of them being seen as a national minority. And by that I mean the quote-unquote Negro, Black African American community, which was being called, of course, that at that time, was starting to be seen as a national group. It was seen as a problem, but nonetheless it was seen as a collective, and it was a national phenomenon. The reason Samora was able to do that is because in 1966, he publishes a book called La Raza, Forgotten Americans, which again, very few people have read. The first comprehensive study on Mexican Americans with limited amount of money, but it does come forward. I would highly recommend it. And it's in there where he really starts to talk about Mexican Americans as a national minority, to see that a Mexican American from Colorado and a Mexican American from California are important to compare and to look at, because that's something that's not done. In relationship to that is, we call it in our book that he's the first person to sort of use this sort of multi-spatial analysis of this community. In other words, the comparison between someone from San Antonio and someone from Los Angeles, and begin to create this person, this community, which prior to that is basically ignored, because remember, it's not till the 1960s that you see the urbanization of Mexican Americans, because prior to that period, they're very, very much rural, and they start to enter into the cities by around that time, and so all these issues are raised, and he's able to capture that as early as 1966, and does a fine job in that book project. A couple of other things to mention that are important in terms of his work is that he's a very, very early pioneer of medical sociology, which now some people really talk about as something central to the academy, but he was writing on medical sociology in 1954. He was working with Lyle Saunders in Colorado, and the reason Julian was fascinated with it was in terms of the healthcare to poor Spanish-speaking communities, and he was able to have quite an impact in those very early writings in the 1950s. And the other thing which is appropriate with regards to why we are presenting here with TBI is Julian was doing border studies and immigration studies in 1950, 1955 to be exact, him and Charles Loomis at MSU. And then Samora goes on from MSU. It's really MSU is what launches him. I mean, the work on border is what launches him to go to Notre Dame and the work he's doing. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, he gets funding through Ford to do a major border studies project. And the students who are in on that, of course, are Alberto and Jorge Bustamante. And the book that gets published out of that is called Los Mojados, which is a book about immigration. And it actually has a very powerful participant observation by Jorge, who actually crosses the border and speaks to those issues. Again, people aren't reading these books anymore, but they're very important. And when we talk about the border today and we talk about immigration as this contemporary phenomena, there were people like Julian that were doing that work in a very, very early period.
So when Julian retired, he got a letter from a man named Lloyd B. Harris, who said, "I think I'm your uncle. My brother, Fred Harris, I believe, is your father." So they started a correspondence, and Lloyd sent photographs, and this is Juana Jaques, who was Fred's great-grandmother, and she claimed to be French, and she looks fairly prosperous. And included in the packet of letters and photographs, I found this. This is my grandfather, Fred Harris. Now, my father went looking for his genealogy, and they spoke Spanish in Pagosa Springs, and he had always heard his father's name referred to as Jerez. So he went in the archives in Spain and looked up Jerez and didn't find anything. So when he discovered that he was actually Harris, he sent us, all of his children, a letter and said, "Well, I'm considered to be the father of Chicano studies, and I'm really Anglo." But then he said, "I've been teaching for 25 years at Notre Dame, and I am of Irish extraction, so I guess I belong here after all." So in 1989, he started to get sick, and he didn't know what was wrong, and there were lots of different kinds of diagnoses, and people told him he had Parkinson's, and he said he didn't have Parkinson's, and he didn't want to take the medicine, and we were all exasperated with him. And my brother Jeff took him to the Mayo Clinic, and he took him to different doctors in Indianapolis, and Jeff told me about a time when Dad was lying naked on a gurney, and the doctor was called away, and Dad turned to Jeff and said, "So this is what it comes to." And this was a man who had fought for social justice all of his life. And when it became clear that Dad couldn't live by himself and that he wouldn't live with Jeff, we tricked him to come to my house in Albuquerque. And I'll tell you, I was not looking forward to this experience. But I was able to get him to a neurologist named Neil Hermanowitz, who examined him very carefully and told him that, "You're right, you don't have Parkinson's. You have progressive supranuclear palsy, and it goes quicker to death." And he said, "The medicines you're taking won't help. There's nothing to help you, but I will talk to Carmen about what she can do to make you comfortable, because the end can be very difficult." And then my dad, even though he had just been given a death sentence, thanked the doctor and said, "It's so much better to know what the real story is." And I think that not knowing had really messed with his mind, and he was so grumpy and irritable because he didn't know what was happening to his failing body. And so for the next 18 months, we all gathered. His grandchildren and children came from various parts of the country, and we actually got to know our dad because he had been traveling for most of the years I was growing up. And I just want to read you the end of my chapter. In the car on the drive home from the hospital, I squeezed his hand. He smiled and said, "What next?" What did come next, I could never have predicted. He seemed to accept the reality that he had completed all the work he was going to complete. For the remaining 18 months of his life, the all-consuming drive to succeed ebbed. It was replaced with sweetness, a cheerful openness to the love of his family. David, my older brother, came down from his home in Santa Fe nearly every weekend to spell me and to visit with his father. John and Jeff and the grandchildren came to visit frequently. Colleagues and former students visited from across the country. Most revealing to me, my dad never complained. He was in constant discomfort or pain. He was often completely helpless, but his abiding cheeriness made caring for him a beautiful and intimate experience. The night before he died, I was awakened by the sounds of his struggling to breathe. I went to his room to offer whatever comfort I could. David was asleep on the floor, having stayed up late reading to Dad. I read to him for a bit and wanted to keep him company. As I gave him sips of water, he took my hand and struggled to say, "I am not in pain." Julian died later that morning. Grace is granted to children who care for their parents. Grace is granted even to the child who is reluctant and unsure, as I had been. And grace is granted to the parent who allows his children to care for him as he reveals his loving nature to them. It is never too late for redemption. For the 18 months that my father lived with my family in Albuquerque, he modeled a graceful dying. He allowed my brothers and me to talk about his death with him, to plan for our futures as huérfanos. We were able to bring up past hurts with each other and gain a clean slate. It was as if his suffering was enabling us to heal the family wounds. My father's final gift to me was the gift of his love. Julian Samora died February 2nd, 1996 in Albuquerque on the 148th anniversary of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful story. It was very inspiring. I know that there's probably some questions in the audience, so why don't we just take a few if we can and direct them to either Alberto or Carmen.
Well, it's not exactly about your dad, but since you're telling stories, you should tell you the story of how your mother got her name.
Oh, yes. My mother's name was, her birth name was Lisiada Piedad, and Piedad means mercy. And when she was 6, her uncle took her to school to register for first grade. And the teacher, the Anglo teacher, said, "Does she have a nickname? I can't pronounce her name." And the uncle said, "Yes, we call her Betty." Well, they didn't call her Betty. That was just some figment of his imagination that popped in his head. And when I was finally doing the numbers on this, her uncle was 6 years older than she. He was 12 years old, facing the teacher, facing authority. And my mother never got her name back. And I was talking to my brothers. She's buried in South Bend under the name of Betty Samora. And I think we should have a little plaque that says, "She's really Lisiada Piedad." My dad called her Piedad. Thanks for bringing it up.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's very moving to me, especially because my mentor, who was also very involved in social movements, just died. And so I had a few questions about that. One, I was wondering, I was part of a grad program that came out of the movements of the 60s, but here you're talking about somebody who gets in the academy, but then is dedicated to knowledge and social movements. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, including something that's discussed in the book a little bit, but I'd like to know more about the groundkeepers strike and Samora's support of that. And of course, this is pretty extraordinary because he's supporting a strike against the institution that he's part of. So I was wondering if you could talk about that and his, the way he conceptualized his work in relationship to social movements.
Well, you answer that part of it, and I'll talk about the groundskeeper strike.
Thank you, Tom. I think that Julian can be put into the generation known as the Mexican-American generation, and Mario Garcia has written an incredible book on it. He mentions Julian, but he doesn't do more work on it. But this was a community that, those of you who know ethnic studies, was wanting to be part of the American dream, part of American culture, but they unfortunately met the ugly face of racism. So if you look at, for example, African Americans, American Indians, so many communities that during the 1950s thought that they were also going to be part of this community, they unfortunately woke up to the rude reality that they weren't. And the case that captures that the best for Mexican Americans is the guy who comes back from the war, whose name escapes me right now, and he's not allowed to be buried in the cemetery along with all of the other Anglo soldiers. And there's a book on his life, and that's what started so many of the social movements in the 1950s, because voila, they woke up to the reality that here they had fought side by side with Anglos in the war, and now when they came back to the United States, they were second class. It's happened to everybody of color. So I'm saying that because Julian, I think, very much wanted to integrate, but it was not possible. And as we see throughout the process, that was not the situation. I had many conversations with him where he was very systematic about wanting to stay in the Midwest because he felt that's where he could really get his best work done. He felt that if he came to the Southwest and he had offers to come to UCLA and UNM, it would get more complicated. So there was something very interesting about him wanting to set up shop at Notre Dame and in the Midwest, and from there sort of do his work. And that's why I think that sort of national sort of agenda is what sort of came forward, because I think if he would have come to the Southwest, I think he would have gotten caught up in the politics of the movement and would have done very different work. And what was interesting is that he became so famous that people were coming to him. And I didn't read a section in my chapter where when Ford, what's going on is there's unrest in the communities. It's when you're having a lot of the issues in Watts and those areas. So the first thing that happens is Ford is saying, let's use some of our philanthropic money to calm these folks down. And that's why they throw money at the African American community. So then they said, since we want to do that with African Americans, let's also do it with the Chicano community. They were going to do it with the Puerto Rican community, but then they pulled back. So when they said, well, let's look for these Mexican Americans, so the first thing they did is they came to UCLA. And when they got to UCLA, all the administrators told them, there's nobody here who's doing that work. You have to go to South Bend. And they go, South Bend? And they said, yeah, the guy that's doing this work is in South Bend, Indiana. So then all these Ford people end up going to South Bend, and that's what, I mean, there had already been a relationship established, but that's what really sort of moves forward this kind of work. So I guess he comes in prior to that, but he gets swept up into it. He's able to benefit from it, and we're able to benefit from it, in terms of those of us who were undergraduates and were trying to go to school as a result.
Now, the groundskeepers struck because they wanted to form a union, and Father Hesburgh at the time was the president of the Civil Rights Commission, and he was not in favor of the groundskeepers forming a union. The groundskeepers, and then later the people who worked in the laundry, and also the people who were the servers in the cafeteria, joined the strike. And most of them, I'd say they had been Polish Americans and Irish Americans, and then by the time the strike happened, they were mostly Mexican Americans. And my dad was very supportive of their efforts, and I remember in every community we went to, he joined either the St. Vincent de Paul Society or the Knights of Columbus, and then he would go out and find the poorer people in the community and try and organize them. So one of the things that he did in support of the groundskeepers was that he and Olga Villapara, who writes about it, they hired one of those blimps or a plane that flies around during football weekends, and they wrote something not very attractive to Father Hesburgh on the end of that plane supporting the groundskeepers strike, and they paid in cash, so the university was never able to trace them. And that was one of the things they got away with. And then in doing the research, Olga discovered that Father Hesburgh and his administration actually hired the same attorneys that the Gallo family had used when they broke the strike for against Cesar Chavez. So that was just really dirty dealings. Eventually, the groundskeepers got their union eventually, and I think Julian played a key role, but very much behind the scenes. He had tenure, so they couldn't do anything to him, but he felt that it was something that he could do in support. So everybody knew he was supportive, but he wasn't really in the forefront.
I'm wondering why Notre Dame wasn't as supportive of the Mexican-American graduate studies program as they could have been, especially when Ford seemed to be recognizing the importance of the work that he was doing. And it seems like Notre Dame might have sort of didn't embrace an opportunity for them to enter into a real progressive university and academic work in this area. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think we both can speak to that. They just simply didn't know what they had. My dad was the only Mexican-American professor for 19 of the 25 years that he worked there. In 1970 or 71, they hired the first black professor. Notre Dame lost a huge opportunity to invite Mexican Americans and other Latinos onto their campuses. As a Catholic university, they could have embraced a Catholic population, but they didn't. People thought of Julian as a total anomaly. They didn't understand what he was doing. They didn't value that he was bringing his cultural mores with him, that as he let these 57 students in, he was demonstrating that people of color can absolutely function in the dominant society, but with their own cultural capital, that they didn't have to become white or sell out in order to be trained and then give a significant contribution. I think later, when the students and administration, after Father Hesburgh retired, other students and the administration were able to convince the new president that they should have a Latino Studies Institute, and then Gilbert was hired. And then for the last 10 years, Gilbert has been trying to recreate what Julian had already had in motion. And they've not been as successful as Julian was on his two nickels. And then Alberto has a wonderful story.
Well, you know, I mean, Jesus, let me just say this. I'll just throw this out there for you football fans. Why is it that, you know, someone like Charlie Wise has so many years at Notre Dame and fails miserably? Hold on. Get someone like Willingham first year. We're talking about an African-American coach versus a white coach. So I'll just sort of leave it there, because that crosses my mind. I mean, they've done everything to salvage Wise as this coach, and that he's an incredible person who's failed. And what crosses my mind is here you have this person of color who, at the first moment, is questioning And it's a very important thing to look at in terms of the way the university runs. The book was not accepted by Notre Dame Press. This was a press that Julian actually helped put on the map. We took it to the university.
It wasn't academic enough.
We took it to the University of Illinois Press, and there's a series on Latinos in the Midwest that's kind of published. You know, it's like, these issues around ethnic studies and around diversity, whatever you want to call it, in higher education, is always a double-edged sword. And you're of the community, you're in the community, but you're not of that community. You're always having to navigate that world. And I owe the skills that I have, that I've acquired and have used at this university. Julian was excellent. He was a trickster. He knew how to maneuver things and get things done. And it's like, what does the saying go, that the best form of tact is you tell somebody where to go, and they tell you, how do I get there? And it's kind of like that same idea that he was so good at really understanding this politics, because he had to learn it, he had to survive. And I learned a great deal about that just spending time with him and looking at all the ways he negotiated. So it's a very complicated story in terms of what he was able to do. And what happens for me, what happens in Catholic higher education, what happens at this institution as well, is there's no process. So as soon as Julian is gone, all of this work and all of this important energy is gone. But yet we're still around, and we've been able to acquire the degrees, but it doesn't continue. And I've seen it at this university, where it's the work of a couple of people who are doing this very important work. It's not the work of the institution. It's not the vision of the institution. It's not till somebody starts to push and ask, and that's what you see. So it's a real complicated situation. And the reason Julian was able to do so much was because of the fact that it was a small enough school that he was able to get to know people and do things. But at the same time, it also created a lot. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but you know, because it raises so many things to think about in terms of this kind of question. When Ford first came to Julian, they wanted him to do ethnic studies. When Ford first came to Julian, they wanted him to do interdisciplinary. The university did not support that. But what he did is he became a trickster and said, okay, well, they've got the money, so I'll do what I have with the money, I'll make a Chicano studies, and we'll be able to move forward. But that vision, Ford had asked him to hire more faculty, but there was no institutional support for that. And the reason we know that is because we have reports from the field reporters who were going forward, and they would write these incredible narratives about what had happened and where the university had failed and where they had not done the work that they were offered to do. And Samora just kept on, you know, chugging along and doing the work that he had to do and develop.
And when he retired, he was very afraid that his papers would not be handled properly at Notre Dame. So Gilbert was teaching at the University of Texas at Austin at the time, and he arranged for the papers to go to Austin. They are housed in the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American collection. And there are 110 linear feet of papers. They cover every major political aspect of the second half of the 20th century. I was sent there by a friend of mine just to look at them. This was before I was in graduate school for the third time. And I came back and met with her for lunch and said, now, you sent me there for a reason. And she said, yes, what did you find? I said, well, I expected to find that Julian was on the crest of a wave. And she said, and what did you find? I said, Julian was the wave. He was pushing the whole thing. Bilingual education. Well, the list is long. You saw that whole list of, and that's only a partial list of the boards he was on, immigration, the census, science. He was just involved in everything, which is why I never saw him, which is why my brothers never saw him. After he got ill and we began to understand what his legacy was, we forgave him. And we understand that our family sacrificed too, and it was a good sacrifice. It was very definitely worth it. By educating 57 people, they are now everywhere, and their students, I mean, one of the projects we want to do is a genealogy of those students and where they are. One of them is federal court judge. Many of them are teachers. Many of them are in government service. I mean, you can't deny that the ripple effect of his legacy has really changed the way Mexican Americans see themselves. And of course, he didn't do it by himself. He engaged in networks. And our book shows how he did it. And we're hoping that you will buy this book and take it out to your communities, get your high school teachers to read it, teach it to high school kids, teach it in colleges. This is how you mentor a group of people, and this is the benefit that you reap from it. So, in some sense, his life was a failure because he didn't get the kind of institutional change he was looking for. But when he said his greatest legacy was the students, then you look at his life and you understand his life was nothing but successes, a success that ripples out over and over and over through the generations. Yes?
Thank you very much, Alberto and Carmen, for the beautiful visuals and anecdotes and stories that really help us grasp the importance of this intellectual movement, social movement that you've been a part of. I was curious to maybe hear both of you speak a little bit more about the kind of the methodology of putting together the compilation. And I'm also, of course, interested in how this, how it stands as an important example of an ethnic studies project. I'm thinking in terms of looking at the prism of change over time through the life and contributions of a very influential person, and again looking at the social context, looking at the way this person stands as a model of responding to exclusions and erasures, but also how you view again the process that you went through in actually pulling the collection together. And how that stands as an important model that we can take as educators who want to perhaps maybe go through some of that kind of work for ourselves and encourage our students to do it as well.
Well, thank you, Jesse. I think the most important one, and several of our students are here, is that we have to tell our own story, because if we don't tell it, nobody's going to tell it.
Well, that's very true. The men that I'm dealing with, los tres, they were not raised to talk about themselves. They weren't raised to, put themselves ahead of anybody else. They're very modest, very humble, and very genuinely humble. I mean, it wasn't an act. And consequently, nobody knows about them. So we have to tell our own stories, and we have to tell the stories of our grandfathers and grandmothers, and we have to make our children tell their stories, because they're very important. When I think of what we've already lost, I just shudder. The Julian Samora Legacy Project is engaged in connecting with some of these people and taking their oral histories, and then we're going to use them and the papers to write an e-curriculum for teachers of high school students and college students. I think one of the best ways that we can learn from our elders is to then teach the children. And in terms of how we put this book together, we had a very different idea in mind. It was going to be an intellectual biography, more or less the way you would see an academic book, you know, that we've read tons of and yawned through. But that's what we were going to do because we wanted to get it published by an academic press. But the book wouldn't be born that way. And as one of my tasks has been to find all of these people. And I remember years ago dialing up people and saying, oh, are you so-and-so? Did you go to Notre Dame? And then I told them what I was doing. I'm not kidding you. They all cried. They all told me, your father, and then the story would come out. And the stories were so moving and so important. And when the three of us, I'm so sorry Barbara's not here, the three of us would meet at each other's homes, and as we fleshed out what each of us was going to write, we would tell a new story. And we decided, well, those people that he influenced also need to be a part of it. So if you read this book, the second part of it, you'll read, we asked them to limit them to 7 to 10 pages so that they could be assigned very easily. But they're just lovely aspects of how they were engaged in this community. It wasn't only about Julian or just about Julian or just about my mother or our family or the beans and red chili that we would provide to students, or, I mean, they were forming community, learning how to build networks and take that out into their lives. And this is a demonstration of how it's done. It's showing, not telling. So my parents had the idea of mentorship as a lifestyle, not that, you know, you go home at the end of the day and you hold office hours twice a week. That was not their lifestyle. It was you open up the home, you see a kid across campus, you don't know him, you go up and say, would you like to come to dinner? And that's how you build community. It's pretty much 24 hours a day.
I wanted to say, Jesse, that one of the things that we say in the book, I had to look it up again because I don't remember the language, we say that the book is a living document. And that, for me, came to pass when we interviewed Ken Martinez, who was the gentleman that Carmen read from. And Ken wasn't sure he wanted to participate in this. He said he wasn't a very good writer, and he wasn't sure that this was something he wanted to do. So we sat with him the whole afternoon and interviewed. And by the time he was done, we were all crying. And it was incredible story. And I highly recommend his chapter. So what we did is we recorded it, and then we began to transcribe it, and then we worked with him to try to build on that. And so in many cases, that's the way the book was coordinated and organized. After the 1985 reunion and the reception in honor of Julian, there was conversation about a book happening. There was some contact with presses and stuff, but it didn't get very far. And I still have, very vivid memories of sitting with Dr. Samora at a Knox conference, and we're having lunch, and he said, hey man, whatever happened to that book you guys were going to write about? And so as I began to think in my chair, I said, I don't know. And that never left me. So I, as the, youngster in the group, I went to my elder scholars and asked them, and they kind of like, get away, we want to talk to you. And so I just felt this real drive, and then started talking to Carmen, and then started talking to Barbara, and then that's how this whole thing sort of started coming together. And we wanted the personal narratives from the folks, but we didn't realize they were going to take the shape that they did. And in many ways, there's something very interesting about reading narratives either separately or reading them collectively, because I think they teach so many different things from so many different perspectives. people who are doing scholarly work that are now doing they're doing the work that Samora trained them to do, and then more sort of personal narratives and personal interaction. So, so that's in many ways how this came forward.
I'd like to read 2 very short paragraphs from, I just finished teaching this book in my class at UNM, and I had students write a response. One student says, while reading Moving Beyond Borders, I started experiencing something that I didn't know was bothering me in the first place. I was envious. I was envious of these people, of their stories, of the influence that this man had on them. I came to college expecting to find a Julian Samora of my own. I wanted to be influenced, I wanted to be uplifted, I wanted to be challenged, and I wanted to be changed. But instead of these things, I received petty criticism. Julian Samora offered knowledge with no strings attached. He offered compassion with open arms, and he offered a humble heart that could permeate even the strongest of prejudices. And then another student wrote, throughout my entire experience at UNM, I don't think I ever really felt that impassioned by a teacher. The fact that Samora took so much of a personal interest in the success of his students was what made each of them confident in their own ability to succeed and to continue the work to create a better world for people. It is my hope that I can find this kind of community somewhere that creates such a lasting effect in a world that seems so hard to change. So the students are ready, and we need to teach them.
Well, maybe I don't need the mic. You asked about methodology, and these guys forgot the key methodology in writing this book was food. At least once a year, for several years, Alberto and Barbara would come to our house in Albuquerque, so supposedly to put this book together. But actually, there was a lot of eating, and of course, if you eat, you have to shop. A lot of shopping for food. Well, if you're going to shop and eat, you have to plan the food. So a good part of the day was food. Talking about it, cooking it, and eating it.
Well, and there were recipes to be shared and exchanged. Don't forget that. And we actually came up with a plan that maybe we could do workshops where we do these, we cook and we talk and we build community, and out comes articles or books, or, we'll facilitate that.
But I think it's a great way of writing a book. I mean, I would highly recommend it. So, yeah. I wanted to mention that back in 1980, I want to say, I was a student at UCSD, and I was finishing up. I was at Third College, which no longer exists, for Third College. I didn't know what I was going to do. And at the time, there was a visiting professor of Chicano history, and he's actually here, Ricardo Griswold. I wanted to mention this. Thank you, Ricardo, for being here and everyone. And it was Ricardo who first told me about this guy, because he doesn't remember this, or maybe he does remember this. We were walking back from class, and I said, hey, man, so I want to do this Chicano studies stuff. I don't know what to do. I have no idea. So he pulls out this brochure that had your dad's information. He says, why don't you contact this guy, Julian Samora? He's giving this money out in South Bend, Indiana, at the University of Notre Dame. And I said, yeah, okay, well, that sounds like a possibility. So there you go. The rest is history, but he's the one responsible for that connection. So thank you, Ricardo. Yes.
But I have incredible stories about how they ended up being in the same places and how we ended up being in the movies. But I haven't really told that story. It's in the newspaper article, but not from the family perspective. So do you have any suggestions to start here at USC to change the mindset a little bit about our history?
I think the first thing you have to do is just tell the story. Write it down, talk it into a microphone, a tape recorder of some sort with digital. There's all kinds of devices. The best is in front of a camera, if you can manage that, and just start telling it. There are ways that you can connect with teachers on various campuses who are conducting oral history classes. I think they're somewhat popular now. You know, the radio.
PBS?
Yeah.
NPR?
NPR has that radio documentaries. They go around the country and ask people to tell their stories, and those are very exciting, and they're limited in length. So imagine what you can get if you give somebody an hour to talk. You can form little groups and ask other people to tell their stories. What I found in my class, I got the idea of the cajita from Alberto, and I have students just bring in a shoebox with important things in it, and then talk about it. More formally, they interview their parents and grandparents. What I find is that the students have a new respect for their elders because they don't think of them as young people. They don't think of them as struggling to grow up and make decisions, and they just think of them as their parents or grandparents. So if there's a way to get students in formal classes to start interviewing people in the community, that's another way to do it. And I know that's happening in high schools. But I think if you just start with your own story, make sure you don't throw things out, that you save the pictures, that you scan them, that you move them up to the next platform, I have all these pictures because I come from a family of pack rats, which is so great. Steve won't say it's great, but it's.
I think that in order to reproduce this on this campus, we need 4 new professors in ethnic studies. I think we need that we have everybody major in ethnic studies. Then I think we could begin what you're talking about. I can tell you that, for example, here in our history department, we have made many attempts to cross this in oral history course, and they won't allow us. So it becomes a very complicated situation. We're offering an oral history course, but it's going to suffer because of enrollment. Jesse has worked very closely with, unfortunately, a museum that now has gone under, which is the Museum of New Americans. And they had an incredible studio with top of cutting-edge sound system, and it's no longer. I don't know if the space still available for interviews. Yeah. All right. So there is some resources here in the community. One of them that I know that is actively happening right now, which I was very moved by, is I was in Washington at the American Studies Conference and went to the Smithsonian, and they currently have a wonderful exhibition on the falsetto program. I think it's called Bitter Harvest. And what they're allowing you to do is, if you go online, if you have any braceros in your family or know of them, they can be interviewed. And so they're getting personal stories around the country, and they've created the technology by which to do that. And by the way, that exhibit is going to be traveling. It'll be in San Diego. I just don't know when. And unfortunately, some of the photos that were there are not going to travel, but there was one photographer who just has these incredible pictures of the braceros, just beautiful historic photographs of them getting sprayed with DDT while they're crossing the border, these amazing altars of families, and There's just beautiful photographs. The photographs are online. It's just, if you go to the Smithsonian Museum of American History. Anyway, so there is another way where you could use technology to sort of do what you're speaking about, and you'd have to just create the space where that could happen.
And it doesn't have to be formal. In my husband's family, Nan, who's here with us today, is her family's historian, and she's spent a lot of years amassing all of the documents, and they have a very fun, their family is filled with all kinds of characters. And in my family, I'm the person people send the documents to and the photographs that they uncover. So you can be your family's historian and just be the one that tells the story at family gatherings so that the kids just keep hearing it. And I think once you do that, I mean, I found out that I've been sewing since I was 5 years old, and I always felt kind of weird about it because sewing's not very popular, but I just had this compulsion to sew. And I found out very recently that my grandfather was a tailor and his father was a weaver. So my first master's degree is in fine arts in textiles. Well, I'm legitimate now. It's in my blood. And that's the kind of thing we need to, I really did. In high school, I was always sewing, and I just felt, mm-hmm.
No one really has the documentation of the flow of the number of immigrants that have crossed the border. So in El Paso, that's what we were trying to do. But funding was, not available at the time. But the other part that's important here is that people make assumptions about who the immigrants are that cross the border, as we all know. But there have been Chinese, Irish, German families. I mean, it is unbelievable. But we really don't have the documentation. So since I've been here at this university, I keep hammering and thinking in my way to say, we need to pay attention to those on both sides of the border because, frankly, it's the future.
Yeah.
And we need to start documenting. And a university is supposed to be a place where we should be able to do that very easily. But anyway, since, again, I'm not in the academic, I'm doing totally different kinds of work, but my personal interest is still there. And whenever I can move a little seed, I move it. But the history, I think, is one of the most important elements for us to start moving forward.
Great. Thank you. I just want to be conscious of the time. I know that,
We've got a party to go to.
yeah, we said we'd be out of here by 7. It's almost 15 after. So before I invite you to join us at the reception in the book signing, I just wanted to extend another thanks to Carmen and to Alberto for providing this history. Great.
Thank you.
They'll be around to talk after the event, I
Yeah,
believe.
there's
So.
food outside and a lot of it, so please go and eat.
Great. Thank you.